Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Aldinga Bay Baptist. Glad you're here today. We're going to jump into God's Word, but before we do that, let's just pray together, shall we? Father, thanks for the opportunity to just open your Word, to hear what it's got to say, to hear the words of Jesus. And I pray, Father, that as we do this morning, that you would just really help us to hear it and hear it properly and continue to work in our lives, we ask, for your glory's sake. Amen. So, as you've probably worked out, this is Sermon 3 from our Return of the King series, Matthew 24 and 25, which is also known as the Olivet Discourse. It's a really important passage, this one, because it's a passage that talks about what this world is going to be like as we wait for the return of Jesus. And that's really been the last two sermons, the details of that, wars, rumours of wars, pestilence, and then we have the stuff from last week about the abomination of desolation and this great persecution that's going to take place for God's people. So really that's the detail of the last two sermons. But today, as we come to this text, what we see is that Jesus is actually just taking it a step further. The next point, if you like, that Jesus is bringing, and really that next point is all about the application. And so you think, well, that's great, isn't it? Because we've had a lot of detail, but how should it change us? What is that supposed to mean for us? The application, what is it? And really, it's this idea of vigilance, if you like. Jesus is talking about vigilance. I want to get to the detail of that in a minute, but before we do, I was thinking, well, that's pretty much the way it is, isn't it? It's not surprising that Jesus is talking about vigilance, because when it comes to all big events that are life-changing, it seems that we're called toward being vigilant. It's just what it's like in the world at the moment. COVID-19, and what they're telling us is make sure you wash your hands, make sure you sneeze into your elbow, and if you're not feeling well, then just stay away. And then before we had COVID-19, we had the bushfire season, over summer. It's a big thing for Australians. And again, it was all about vigilance, wasn't it? It's like, so make sure you've got your fire plan, make sure you've cleaned your gutters, decide beforehand whether you're going to stay or whether you're going to go. It's really important that you're vigilant, watch the weather. And when you come to this passage, it's exactly the same thing. This is a massive thing. This is the return of Jesus. It's from a Christian perspective. If Jesus is right, then it's all about the biggest event this world has ever known, the return of the King. So it's about being vigilant. And the detail of that is what I want us to look at today. What does it really mean to be vigilant? Well, 3 points I want to bring out. One is about clarity. Second one is about a warning against apathy. And then thirdly, it's this idea of humility. Okay, so let me just unpack those and we'll be done. First one, clarity. This is how it goes. In the text, the first few verses that Barb read for us, Matthew 24, verse 32, Jesus says this, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates." And what's Jesus saying there? Well, it is about clarity. It's about certainty, if you like. Jesus is really telling us that he's not some speculator. That's really the point that Jesus is making. It's not like Jesus has said all these things and he's saying, I think this is how it plays out. I reckon this is the way that it's going to end. It's not like that at all. Jesus is saying, I want you to know there is great certainty around this. There is this great clarity. And he gives this illustration of the fig tree sort of to help us think along those lines. And I think, it's a great illustration because that's how it works, isn't it? In fact, I actually have a fig tree in my backyard. And at the moment, we're at the dead of winter. In fact, last weekend was the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. And so I look at my fig tree at the moment in the dead of winter, and there's not a leaf on it. It's all very barren. It almost looks dead. But surely, come September, October, and that thing is just going to burst into life. It's just going to shoot new leaves, and there's going to be buds on there for the fruit to come from. And in fact, that's going to be true of absolutely every fig tree that's alive in the southern hemisphere. And it's not just the fig trees, but in our region we've got all these beautiful grapevines, and that's what's so wonderful about the springtime, isn't it? We look out and those vines that look dead just burst into life with new leaves. And what Jesus is saying is you can actually bet your life on it, that when you see the fig tree shooting, summer is coming. And that's exactly the idea here. He is at the very gates. So this is really important for us to hear that certainty. But there's a little bit more in this text that I want us to look at on that point of certainty, because there's this, I think it's this point or this verse that drives it home even more. But it's one that is a little bit controversial, and it's what Jesus says next in verse 34. Just have a listen to it. Jesus says these words, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place." I think, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? In fact, some people have said that Jesus has painted himself into a corner here, and it's been famously said by some atheists or people that don't want to accept what Jesus says, is that Jesus actually got it wrong. In fact, there's this famous quote by a bloke by the name of Bertrand Russell. Some of you might have heard of him. He was a 20th century intellectual and also a famous atheist. And Bertrand Russell wrote a book that's called Why I'm Not a Christian. And I was actually just doing some research on it this week, in fact reading another book which was quoting it. And in that book, Bertrand Russell says, why I'm not a Christian, one of the reasons is because of what Jesus says here. He's saying, Bertrand Russell says, Jesus clearly thought that he was going to come again before the generation that was alive at his time died. That's the idea that they're saying here. And then Russell goes on and says, well, clearly Jesus isn't supremely wise. Clearly he got it wrong. And I think it's a really important question for us, because we do need to better answer that. What is Jesus saying here? Again, the verse, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." What's he talking about? It's a great question, isn't it? Well, you probably won't be surprised that there's quite a few different opinions around the way that we should take that verse, because the Olivet Discourse, as we said last week, it's got a few verses in there that make it one of the most disputed passages in the way that we should understand it. So, but this is the way that I would understand it. That verse, I think the best way to understand that is probably the most simple way, and also perhaps the most profound. I think what Jesus is saying here, when he says this generation won't pass away, he's actually not at all talking about his return. He's actually just talking about the events leading up to his return. One of the things that backs that up is that almost in the next breath, Jesus goes on and says, but concerning the day and the hour of his return, nobody knows when that's going to be, not even the angels, not even the Son of God himself, talking about himself, surprising. It's only the Father that knows when Jesus is going to come again. So I think it's a good case to say that Jesus isn't so much talking or focused so much on when he returns, but as I said, he's talking about the events leading up to that. That generation will be around to see those events. I think, well, that was fulfilled with stunning accuracy, wasn't it? Because when you think about it, this whole Sermon on the Mount, Olivet Discourse, rather, is kicked off by Jesus making this statement to the disciples as they walk through Jerusalem. And he looks at the temple and he says, I tell you, not one of these stones is going to be left upon another. And their question is like, no way, Jesus, when is this going to take place? And he unpacks this whole series or this whole talk as a result of that. It's amazing, really. Jesus, goes on and talks about the abomination of desolation and the destruction of Jerusalem. And as we know, in AD 70, that's exactly what took place. Just some 40 years later, the Romans roll through and they just destroy the Jewish people. So when Jesus says, when you see that day coming, don't come down from your rooftops, flee. If you're working in the field, don't go back for your coat. It's going to be a terrible time. And that's exactly how it was, as we talked about last week. And then they offered up their worship to Caesar in the temple, we're told by historians, and then they leveled the temple. I think that's really interesting, isn't it? What that's telling us is that when Jesus says, I tell you that this generation won't pass away, there's something incredible about that, because nobody, this is what I really love about it, is that nobody saw that coming. That's why the disciples are so rattled when Jesus says that. Nobody expected that within that generation, the temple and Jerusalem itself would be leveled and destroyed. But Jesus foretells it, and it's exactly what happens. So that tells me something. Jesus knows what he's talking about. That tells me something, that when we read these words of Jesus, we see that Jesus has certainty. He has clarity, but we're supposed to have clarity as well. And that's the first point around vigilance. What does it mean to be vigilant? Well, it's really about, I think, having clarity. It's for me to say, Andrew, look at what Jesus said and actually look at what happened. And you really need to stop and take this seriously. It's about clarity. First point makes sense. Second point is moving on to this warning about apathy. And again, it's pretty easy to see in the text. Let me read it for you, picking it up in verse 37. Jesus gives this illustration. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, until the day of Noah when he entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. This is a passage, it's about apathy, as I said, and it kind of just makes sense. And it's interesting, isn't it, when Jesus talks about the flood here, just the way he frames it. Because when I think about the flood, I actually, if it was me, I wouldn't frame it that way. You know, the generation living at that time, I would say probably what it says in Genesis about that generation, that when God looked at these people, he was grieved in his heart that he'd made humanity, because their thoughts and intents of their heart were continually wicked all the time. That's the thing that I would have thought that framed this generation. And it did, and Jesus isn't denying that, but he's actually picking up something else. He's picking up on the fact that they were just getting on with their life. In fact, it's all the good things, isn't it? Eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. It's like they were just focused on the here and the now. They were making the most of the good times. Meanwhile, here's Noah building an ark in the middle of the desert because he's awaiting the coming of the flood. But they're unaware. They just, in spite of that, they just didn't care. They just got on with their lives and they ignored God. But then eventually, this is the point for us, isn't it? Then eventually the flood comes and washes them all away. And Jesus is saying, mark it down. There is certainty that I'm coming again. And as I'm coming, as we said last week, it's the best of days and it's the worst of days. It's the greatest of days because he's coming to make all things new. But it's sobering, and we don't want to take this lightly. It's sobering because he also says it's the worst of days because he's coming in judgment against the enemies of God. And Jesus is saying, just take note, because it's going to be like that, and that's exactly where it goes. He says, then 2 men will be in a field, one will be taken, the other will be left, like the days of Noah. 2 women will be grinding at a mill, one will be taken, the other will be left. Therefore stay awake and know what day your Lord is coming, for you do not know what day, rather, your Lord is coming. It's a really important passage, isn't it? Apathy. I just want to think about that for a minute. Apathy. This is one of the things about us as people, I reckon, is that we are people that when we're in the moment, when something bad has just been announced into our life, like, say, COVID-19, we panic and we panic buy and we go to the shops and we strip the shelves, go to the shops and we strip those shelves bare and take it home. That's exactly what happened. But then when the crisis is over, it's almost like we say, what are they talking about? It wasn't that bad. And we sort of forget about the future. We just don't worry about it as much anymore. And we're like that with so many things, aren't we? In fact, I was watching a documentary on TV the other day, and it was about the environment, and it sort of got me thinking It was scientists talking about the environment, and it got me thinking, boy, there's a lot of documentaries about the environment. There has been a lot of documentaries about the environment, and that the scientists, when you watch them, whether it be David Attenborough or something else, they say we can't keep on using plastic and making plastic like we are. Look at what we're doing to the oceans. Or they say we can't keep on burning fossil fuels like we are because the sea levels are rising and we're in dire straits if we keep on going that way. And they're banging on about that all the time for one very good reason. There's documentary after documentary about that. It's because they know that we're apathetic. They know that we look out at this world and we think, life's going pretty well. I like my car, I'm driving it, plastic bags are easy. And so they're trying to drum into us, you're not going to get away with that forever. And that's because that's the way we are. We're very present in the moment, and we sometimes don't look down the track and look to the future. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. He gives not only this illustration about apathy, but when I read through this text, I'm not sure if you noticed it, when Barb read it through, or if you read it through yourself, there's actually illustration after illustration on exactly the same subject. Jesus sounds like a broken record. So there's this first one about the days of Noah. They were just unaware. They were eating and drinking. They were getting on with their life, and they were ignoring the peril that was coming. And then Jesus goes on and gives a second illustration about a thief in the night. He says, if the master of the house had known what time the thief was going to come, he would have stayed awake. But Jesus is really telling us, you don't know when he's coming again, so stay awake, be aware. And then Jesus goes on to another illustration again, and this time it's about a man with two servants. One's a faithful servant. When the master's gone, he does the right thing. The other one is unfaithful. The master's gone, and he doesn't care. He just lives in the moment and forgets about the fact there's a future. So Jesus is telling us something. That's what we're like, and that's what he's warning us about. We've got to hear that. And then there's another illustration as well, and I thought I'd just spend a little bit of time quickly unpacking that, because I reckon that we probably don't get it at all as Australians, or we struggle to understand it anyway. But it's worth hearing because again, it's about apathy, but also it makes another point that I want us to hear. And it's the story of the 10 virgins that Barb had read for us. Some translations it's entitled The 10 Bridesmaids, and it's really appropriate both ways, because that's what it's about. It's about 10 young women who happen to be bridesmaids. See, this illustration, which you probably picked up, is actually an illustration about a wedding. But it's a little bit different to the way that we do weddings. See, in our day, what happens with weddings is that we all go to the church, or we go to the park, or we go to the winery, whatever it is, and the groom is already there, and the guests are there, and everybody's waiting for the bride. And typically, I've done lots of weddings as a pastor, typically she's late, sometimes probably later than what she should be. And I go out to the car, because it's my job to be one of the first people to greet her. And I go out to the car, and if she's really late, she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, my hair took too long, or my makeup took longer than what I thought, or the traffic was terrible," just a whole lot of reasons, and I'm sure that they're very valid. But in this case, it's not the bride that's late, it's actually the groom that's late, and that's because they did weddings really differently in those days. Weddings were often at night, and what happened was the bridegroom, along with his entourage, his men, they would leave the groom's house and they'd march their way to the bride's house, and that's where the wedding would be. And the bride would be there, and the bridesmaids would be there, and they'd be waiting for the coming of the groom, the announcement that he's coming. And that's exactly what's going on here. So if it goes late into the night, because they don't have clocks, they don't have watches like we do, it's just kind of like he's coming in the nighttime sometime. But it's an interesting point. It says that the groom was delayed. And eventually he comes, but when he comes, he's met by these 10 bridesmaids. And we're told that there's 5 of them that were wise and 5 of them were foolish. And the thing that splits them is the fact that the wise ones have brought extra olive oil with them to trim their lamps and to burn that in case he's late, but the foolish ones don't. And then eventually, because he is delayed, he comes in the middle of the night, and the foolish ones don't have any oil left for the groom to come, and so they have to shoot off to the shop and get some more. And while they're gone, here's the point. They missed the arrival of the coming of the groom. And not only did they miss the arrival of the coming of the groom, Jesus tells us, but they missed the entire wedding feast. This is how it goes in verse 10. And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and he shut the door. Wow. Afterwards, the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open the door up to us. But he answered very solemnly, this is a solemn passage, isn't it? Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you neither know the day nor the hour. So clearly it's another story about apathy, really. It's another story of not being ready. The application is really simple. It's watch, because you don't know the day or the hour. But there is another point in there as well, isn't it? It's that the bridegroom is delayed. See, Jesus said he doesn't know when he's coming again, but it's like he's tipping his hat here to say it's going to be some time. I think that's really important for us, because here we are, it's the year 2020. And it's been around about 2,000 years since Jesus left. It's been an awful long time. An awful long time while he's been waiting at the gates, so to speak, from that verse before. But we shouldn't be surprised that it's been that long. I mean, in fact, Peter says that a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years to us. In fact, he says that in the very context of the return of Jesus. It's like the Bible is hinting at the fact that it could take some time. Yet it's taken so long, and as a society, it's like we've given it up, and we say, I don't know if he's ever going to come, and we just live as if this whole thing is just some story. Nice story, but that's all that it is. When I stop and think about this text, the whole point of it, the whole point that Jesus is making, is the point of vigilance. He's saying there is certainty. There is great clarity that you are to have, because he is coming again. In fact, his words earlier on, we didn't read them, but his words earlier on were these: heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. It's a powerful verse, isn't it? All right, Jesus has changed this world more than anybody, I reckon. There's a great argument for that. And we need to take his words seriously. He says have vigilance, because I am coming again. And watch out for apathy. Such an important idea for us, because we so easily tend toward apathy. We so easily live in the moment, and we forget about the future. Happens in so many ways, and it certainly happens in regard to the return of Jesus. So vigilance, that's what it means. It means those two things: clarity, warning against apathy, and then just one final thing. It's this idea of humility. I want to bring that home. In fact, this idea of humility is not so much found in Matthew's gospel or Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse, but it is actually found in Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse. I was reading it through, and I noticed these are, in fact, the last words in Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse. And it's interesting what Jesus says in his final words. And this is where it ties into the idea of humility. Listen to what he says. Stay awake at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man, speaking about himself. Stay awake and pray that you might have the strength. I think that sounds good, doesn't it? Because I think what Jesus is telling us there is that we actually don't have the strength in and of ourselves. So we need to seek him. And when we seek him, the beautiful news is that we're seeking a God who is generous. That's just what God is like. And that's what he's like, in fact, right throughout the Bible. He's generous. In fact, that's the gospel right there. It can be sort of, I think, summed up around that whole idea of generosity. Here we are, we're anything but humble. Humanity. So often, in fact, that's where we go wrong. We say, I don't want God to rule over me. I want to rule over myself. I want to be the captain of my own ship. And so we go down that track, and we as we've said so many times, we just deny the glory of God, and we try and live our own way. But in spite of that, God doesn't give up on us. He's a God who pursues. He's a God who is generous, and he's so generous he comes himself in the person of Jesus. We're talking about the return of Jesus in this passage, but we've got to remember that the only reason why Jesus is returning is because he came in the first place. When he returns, he comes in power and in might to judge the world and to usher in his kingdom as the great king. But when he came the first time, he comes in humility, and he comes to die for us in order to defeat our great enemies, sin, Satan, and death itself, in order that he might fix the real problem, in order that we can know God, in order that we can be in relationship with him. God is generous toward us in that way. He's offering salvation to us. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weak and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you because it's light. My burden is easy, my yoke is light." It's just a beautiful thought all the way through the Bible. The gospel is telling us that God is generous. We're to look to him in humility, and we can find favour through Jesus when we do that. Humility is the key. So and here's the point, not only does humility save us in that sense, not only are we saved as we look to Jesus in humility and repentance, but also we're to live humble life as well. That's the way to live. Not only is it the way to become a Christian, but it's also the way to live. We're to live humbly, and that's because we need God. We need to rely on him. We don't have the strength in ourselves. When I look at it in context of this passage, I think, well, there's so many things going on, so many things to distract us, so many wonderful things, and those things are the good gifts of God, and so often there's nothing wrong with them, but the problem is they can so easily become the ultimate thing. How can we avoid that happening? Well, by coming to God in prayer and saying, "Lord, I need you. I just need you to be at the center of my life." That's what Jesus is calling us to do, because it's the great temptation in this world is to give that up. And then secondly, we need to come and ask for strength in prayer, because it sounds like it's going to get pretty hot. It already is pretty hot for Christians around the world in so many places. There's so much persecution. We talked about that in the first sermon briefly. And Jesus says that's what the world's going to be like. It's going to maybe wobble back and forward. It's going to ebb and flow, but eventually it's going to come to this point where it's extremely hot to be a follower of God. Extremely difficult. And we're going to need his strength. So how can we live in this world vigilantly? Well, it's taking Jesus' words firsthand. Pray for strength. Come before God in humility. And the beauty is that God will be there for us. Here's a little quote that I thought I'd finish with. It's all about that idea about God being there for us, by a bloke by the name of Richard Sibbs. He says this: "See the contrary disposition of Christ and Satan and his instruments. Satan attacks us when we are at the weakest, but Christ will mend us in all the breaches sin and Satan have made. He binds up the brokenhearted, and as a mother treats most tenderly the most diseased and weakest child, so does Christ most mercifully bend down to the weakest people. He puts an instinct into the weakest things to rely for support on something stronger than themselves. So the vine clings to the elm, the church's awareness of her weakness makes her willing to lean on her beloved." What a great quote that is. It's all about what we're talking about. It's about lean in, because God is there for us. Jesus is coming again. The application is all about vigilance. It's about this clarity. It's warning against apathy, and it's calling us to humility. So I don't know where you're at today, but I reckon that there's so much application there for us. God is calling us just to come to him, acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, acknowledge that we need him. And as we do that, he will be there for us and draw us to himself. I guess that's our encouragement for you today. Let's just pray. Father, we thank you for this text and for the opportunity just to have a look at it now. And I pray that you know all of our hearts, you know who we are, you know where we are in the scheme of things in relation to you, in relation to just the things that are going on in this world and in our lives. I pray that you really speak to us and help us to really look to you, to cling to you, and find that in you there is life. Please, Lord, do a great work and help us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. If you'd like to talk about things further, feel free to just contact us on the on the phone number or the website that was or the email that was on the program earlier. Thanks for being with us today.